Imagine two rooms side by side inside South Korea's government right now. In the first room, you have the professional diplomats, people who've spent their entire careers navigating the delicate relationship with the United States. They're speaking in calm, measured tones, talking about alternative proposals and, carefully managing a crisis. They know the man on the other side of the table is Donald Trump, and their goal is to gently steer him away from a demand so huge, $350 billion, it could trigger a national economic collapse. They're trying to put out a fire.
Yeah, a massive fire.
But in the room next door, the mood is completely different. It's filled with the president's most fervent supporters. They're not whispering, they're shouting.
Right.
They're holding press conferences, calling the American demands nonsense, and accusing the U.S. of treating their country like a vassal state. They're not trying to put the fire out. They're pouring gasoline on it, seemingly convinced that a booger blaze is the only way to be seen.
It's quite the contrast. This isn't just a policy disagreement. It's a battle for the soul of an alliance happening in real time. And it forces you to wonder, what happens when a country's diplomats and its politicians are playing two completely different games with the nation's entire economy on the line?
Welcome to the deep dive. You just heard the tension right there, and it really establishes the high-stakes environment we're analyzing today. Our mission in this deep dive is to dissect this multi-layered crisis currently dominating U.S.-South Korea relations. At the epicenter is a colossal and, deeply disputed $350 billion investment package.
And that figure, $350 billion, it isn't just some number in a trade negotiation. It's really the fulcrum of a potential existential crisis for Seoul. We're dealing with, I think, three interlocked dangers here. First, there's the direct economic threat posed by that cash demand. Second, the profound internal political conflict, which is being ruthlessly leveraged by President Lee Jae-myung's allies. And third, it's the ultimate test of the shifting power dynamics within the decades-old alliance itself.
It sounds like Seoul is caught in a terrible bind. Absolutely. The core dilemma for them is terrifying. Fail to secure a deal, and they face these punitive tariffs, potentially up to 25% on critical exports. But accept the deal as Washington currently structures it. Well, they risk triggering a 1997-style financial collapse. It's a nightmare scenario either way. Okay, let's really unpack the mechanics of this $350 billion standoff. Why is this specific number tied to a tariff reduction so incredibly difficult for Seoul to manage?
Well, the conflict hinges entirely on structure and scale. So the $350 billion commitment is Seoul's proposed trade-off, right? They want Washington to lower tariffs on key Korean goods, especially things like automobiles and other manufactured exports, from that punishing 25% down to 15%.
Which is huge for their economy.
Exactly. This tariff reduction is absolutely critical for the Korean export economy. But the negotiations stalled almost immediately because the U.S. president demanded the full $350 billion up front.
And I understand the U.S. Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, has been particularly, let's say, forceful in defining the structure of this payment. What exactly are they demanding, and why does the structure matter even more than the headline amount?
The structure is really the poison pill here. Commerce Secretary Lutnick insisted the pledged investment must be delivered overwhelmingly in cash or equity, not crucially in the form of phased commitments or commercial loans or even loan guarantees.
Okay, so what's a practical difference? Why is cash so bad?
It's a crucial distinction. When we say cash upfront, we mean a transfer that immediately drains liquidity from Seoul's national reserves. It creates an instantaneous fiscal shock. If Seoul were allowed to structure it as, say, loans or guarantees, the funds would remain available until specific projects were actually initiated. That spreads the risk out over years.
Much more manageable.
Infinitely more manageable. But the cash demand, it's like demanding they empty their savings account overnight.
And to compound that pressure, the U.S. side is clearly using the precedent set by Japan to, ratchet up the demands on Seoul, aren't they?
They absolutely are. Reports suggest the U.S. Commerce Secretary has already pressed South Korea to slightly increase that commitment. He explicitly proposed that Seoul bring its total investment closer to the whopping $550 billion deal that Japan finalized back in July.
Wow.
Yeah. This linkage is Washington's primary leverage tool, but it kind of ignores the fundamental differences between the two nations' financial capacities. Japan's situation is just not the same as South Korea's.
Given this really hardball approach, what was the most telling response from the South Korean side? Something that confirms they view this demand as genuinely impossible, not just, a negotiation tactic.
That came directly from National Security Advisor Lee Sung-lak. His statement was a very clear red flag that this isn't just political theater. He publicly stated that the U.S. demand for a cash investment is, and I quote, objectively and realistically beyond our capacity.
Objectively and realistically beyond our capacity. That's strong language from a top official.
It is, and he stressed that this is a mathematical reality, not political posturing, because of his words, again, no one can meet such a demand regardless of political affiliation. When a national security advisor uses terms like that, the U.S. terms have crossed into truly destructive territory for Seoul.
But Washington's justification for this rigid stance, as you mentioned, is the Japanese deal. They argue, presumably, that offering Seoul a more lenient or phased deal would somehow undercut the agreement, the MOU they established with Tokyo.
Yeah, the Japan deal is definitely the ghost in the room here. It was valued at $550 billion, mostly cash, and was famously described as a blank check because of how much control the U.S. gained.
A blank check? How so?
Well, the structure was really designed to maximize U.S. control and profit. Washington secured effective control over which ventures received the investment funds, essentially dictating the capital allocation. But maybe the most contentious part, especially for Seoul looking at it now, is the profit split mechanism.
Okay, break down that profit split for us, because that sounds like a massive sticking point for South Korea, especially when they talk about commercial rationality.
Right. So in the Japan MOU, the deal initially operated on a 50-50 profit split. That was until the principal investment, the original $550 billion, was recovered by both sides. Okay.
50-50 until the initial money is back. Seems fair enough so far.
Well, yes, but after that principal was returned, the split shifted dramatically. It went to a 90-10 division, with 90% of all further profits flowing back to the United States.
90% to the U.S., even though Japan put up the capital.
That's the structure. And Washington is insisting on that same 90-10 split in its favor for the Seoul deal, even though, again, Seoul is the one providing the massive cash injection.
Okay, I can see why Seoul finds that unacceptable. What are they pushing for instead?
They find it utterly unacceptable. They are pushing for the profit split to favor Korea 90-10, but only until their principal investment is fully recovered.
So the reverse, right, but only temporarily, exactly. To illustrate the difference, the U.S. structure means the U.S. is using Korean money, controlling the investments, and standing to collect nearly all the long-term profits. Seoul's demand, which reflects President Lee Jae-myung's call for commercial rationality, says, look, the investor who took the primary risk, that's us, Seoul must be prioritized for principal recovery before the partner Washington can claim the vast majority of the upside. It's about who carries the initial risk. This difference isn't just about the money then, it's really about control and who bears the risk. If Korea provides the funds, it sounds like they want influence and some protection. What specific safeguards is Seoul demanding that Washington is currently rejecting?
They're seeking two absolutely critical safeguards. First, they want U.S. government guarantees against investment losses. I mean, if Seoul is forced to hand over $350 billion in cash for investments controlled largely by U.S. discretion, they need some kind of backstop to protect against commercial failure.
Right. That makes sense. What's the second safeguard?
Second, they demand a meaningful voice in how the funds are actually allocated. Under the current U.S. proposal, Korea bears this massive financial burden of draining its reserves, but without gaining either management control over the investment decisions or a reasonable assurance of adequate returns.
So all the risk, potentially minimal reward, and no control.
That's precisely how Seoul sees it. It makes the deal fundamentally untenable from their perspective, which leads us directly into what you call the truly chilling part of this deep dive, the economic nightmare scenario. President Lee Jae-myung has directly connected this cash demand to the trauma of the 1997 Asian financial crisis. He has, and he's used that connection very deliberately because the memory of the IMF sickness, as it's known, is still an open wound in South Korea. Lee issued a stark warning that accepting the $350 billion cash withdrawal without essential safeguards would absolutely trigger a crisis similar to 1997.
And remind us, what did that 1997 crisis entail?
That crisis resulted in the humiliating need for an IMF rescue package, severe corporate failures, mass layoffs, and just a profound collective sense of national shame. It's deeply embedded in the national psyche.
Let's look at the numbers again, because they really bring this risk into sharp, shocking focus. How much of South Korea's financial defense shield, their reserves, would this $350 billion commitment actually consume?
The arithmetic really reveals the existential nature of the threat. South Korea's total foreign exchange reserves currently stand at about $410 billion.
Okay.
Okay. The $350 billion commitment being demanded represents a massive 84% of those reserves.
84%. Good grief.
Yeah. You're essentially asking Seoul to dismantle the vast majority of its financial defenses in a single upfront cash transfer. For a G20 economy that relies so heavily on stable financial markets and exports and is perpetually exposed to geopolitical risks from the North draining reserves of that magnitude, it's like removing the entire financial foundation. It invites speculative attacks and potentially disaster.
You mentioned the phantom pain of 1997 earlier. For our listener who might not fully grasp the societal impact of that event, can you elaborate a bit on why that memory is so visceral, so raw for the Korean public?
It's absolutely crucial to understand this wasn't just some economic blip. It was experienced as a national humiliation. The 1997 crisis led to the rapid dissolution of once mighty cables, the big conglomerates. It forced ordinary citizens to participate in this desperate, voluntary national gold collecting drive to try and repay the national debt to the IMF.
People donated their own gold.
Yes. Imagine factory workers, retirees, students lining up to donate family heirlooms, wedding rings, gold necklaces, out of a sense of patriotism, but also deep shame and necessity. That memory instills a profound fear that their national economic fate could be dictated by external forces again. When you talk to someone like a small factory owner today, they remember the job losses, the bankruptcies, the social stigma. For them, securing national economic sovereignty isn't just political rhetoric. It's a promise that they will never have to endure that collective shame again. That trauma is really the engine driving the domestic resistance we're seeing.
And this threat isn't hypothetical, is it? We're already seeing real-time consequences in the financial markets, reflecting this heightened uncertainty.
Oh, the financial stress is already tangible. The Korean won recently broke through the psychologically important 1,400 to the dollar level. Okay. This mark is seen as a critical line in the sand.
Why is 1,400 so significant?
Because once breached, it often signals the need for direct intervention by the central bank, the Bank of Korea. But more importantly, it opens the door wide to speculative selling, the so-called one bears. Traders start betting heavily against the currency's stability, assuming it will fall further.
And if this massive cash outflow were to happen and be fully priced in by the markets, what do the financial projections actually look like for the won?
Market analysts are forecasting severe depreciation. If that full cash outflow is priced in, projections suggest it could push the won down by an average of 100 won per dollar annually for 3 years. It could potentially reach 1,450 per dollar, maybe even worse.
Which would have knock-on effects.
Huge knock-on effects. This currency slide isn't just about buying power. Yes, it makes exports cheaper, but it drastically increases the cost of imports, fueling domestic inflation. That would be extremely painful for households and businesses relying on global supply chains. And at the same time, the Kospi, Seoul's main stock index, has also slipped significantly, falling below the 3,100 level. It just reflects massive investor uncertainty about the country's financial health and its ability to withstand such a severe reserve depletion.
Okay, so if the cash withdrawal is potentially fiscally suicidal, Seoul insists the only mechanism that makes it even remotely considerable is an ironclad, unlimited currency swap line with the U.S. Federal Reserve. Why is this a non-negotiable safeguard for them?
Well, simply put, it's the only mechanism that could possibly replace the financial safety net they are being asked to dismantle. Seoul insists that an unlimited currency swap line is the minimum requirement and a non-negotiable safeguard.
And their argument is?
President Lee correctly points out that South Korea lacks the financial cushion of Japan. Japan holds massive reserves, and its currency, the yen, unlike the won, has reserve currency status. It's treated differently in global markets. The swap line provides a critical safety valve.
How does it work, essentially?
It ensures that if speculative selling or market panic causes a liquidity crisis, a dollar shortage, the Bank of Korea can immediately access an unlimited supply of U.S. dollars from the Fed. This stabilizes the markets and prevents a cascading failure. It's like having a guaranteed emergency credit line from the World Central Bank.
But the signals from the U.S. Fed are that it's highly unlikely to approve an unlimited swap line. So if the U.S. won't offer that, what are they likely to counter with, and why is that proposal probably insufficient for Seoul?
And that's the exact point of the current deadlock. Analysis, including reports from major banks like Citigroup, indicates the Fed is deeply resistant to the unlimited swap line. Why? Because it represents too much unconditional liability for the U.S.
So what's the alternative they might offer?
The likely U.S. counterproposal is access to the FEMA repo facility. That's the Foreign and International Monetary Authority's repo facility. This facility was introduced back in 2020. It allows foreign central banks to borrow U.S. dollars, but they have to use their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities as collateral.
Okay, so it's like a pawn shop for central banks.
Yeah.
You put up your treasuries, you get dollars. Why is that not a sufficient solution for a potential crisis of this scale?
Well, it's insufficient for two main reasons. First, it is fundamentally a limited liquidity measure. The central bank, in this case the Bank of Korea, must possess sufficient U.S. treasuries to use as collateral. And while South Korea holds a good amount, the facility has borrowing caps and limits. It doesn't guarantee the massive immediate dollar access needed to manage an 84% reserve shock.
And the second reason. Second, it's transactional. It's essentially a secured loan, not an unconditional guarantee of liquidity like the swap line. Seoul views it as totally inadequate, like offering a small bandage when they fear needing a full blood transfusion. The Fed's reluctance to offer the unlimited swap line, in a way, actually proves Seoul's point. They are being asked to take this enormous, potentially fatal risk without any meaningful protection from their longtime ally. This extreme economic pressure, this fear, is what provides the fuel for the really dramatic political conflict we see playing out inside South Korea right now. Let's move into that, the domestic tug of war where this financial fear is being weaponized.
Yeah, this internal factional battle is quite fascinating because it's dictating the entire negotiating atmosphere. You basically have two groups fighting not just over policy details, but arguably over the fundamental identity of the nation in relation to the U.S.
Okay, who are the main players?
On one side, we have what you could call the alliance faction. This consists primarily of professional diplomats, career security officials, people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Their goal is pragmatic.
How so?
They use restrained language. They focus on developing alternative proposals that might possibly be palatable to Washington. And above all, they prioritize careful crisis management to avoid a complete rupture in the U.S. relationship. They're trying to manage the situation, playing the long game.
Okay, the careful managers. And then you have the group that's intentionally raising the temperature, the autonomous faction. Who are they and what's their strategy?
The autonomous faction represents the strong pro-Lee Jae-young group, often organized under banners like the Democratic Innovation Conference. They are operating on a completely different frequency. They're using highly inflammatory, openly anti-U.S. rhetoric.
Not just criticism, but anti-U.S.
Yes. They haven't just criticized the demands, they have openly condemned them as nonsense. They've accused the U.S. of treating South Korea not as an equal partner, but as a vassal state or even an annexed country. They frame this very aggressive stance as defending national economic sovereignty and national pride against what they perceive as blatant American coercion.
This creates a really deep emotional contrast in the nation's political discussion, doesn't it? What's the fundamental divide you see between these two internal views?
I think the divide is essentially between appeals to national pride and calculations of pragmatic security. The autonomous faction argues passionately from a position of national identity. Korea is now a global power, a technologically and culturally advanced nation. It must assert that it is not a branch office of the Pentagon, as some have put it. They prioritize national dignity, even if it carries significant risk. And the alliance factions respond. The alliance faction counters with the cold, pragmatic truth of security realities. Their view is basically, pride doesn't stop a missile. They worry deeply that the hardline rhetoric is simply a dangerous game played by politicians for domestic votes, gambling with the essential security shield provided by the U.S. alliance at a time when North Korean threats haven't gone away.
Is this rhetoric purely emotional outburst, though, or is there a more shrewd, calculated political strategy behind this bluster from the pro-Lee faction?
Oh, it appears to be a highly calculated strategy serving multiple purposes at once. First, domestically, it acts as a kind of preemptive shield. If the economy does take a downturn or if the talks ultimately collapse, they can immediately deflect potential criticism. They can point the finger squarely at the unreasonable and predatory U.S. demands, effectively evading government responsibility for any economic woes.
Okay, blame deflection. What's the other purpose?
Second, and this is crucial, they seem to be using the visible and heightened public anger as diplomatic leverage. By broadcasting this extreme domestic resistance, they're sending a message to what they see as a stubborn U.S. administration. The message is, look, our people will not tolerate this. You cannot politically compel us to accept these terms. It's an attempt to turn a domestic political problem into an external negotiating tool.
This approach seems to align almost perfectly with the historical and ideological leanings of President Lee Jae-myung's Progressive Party, doesn't it?
It absolutely reflects a long-standing progressive tendency, yes. Their political DNA often favors what you might call strategic ambiguity over the full, unconditional embrace of U.S.-led alliances. This is particularly true when they're balancing relationships with regional giants like North Korea, China, and Russia. The autonomous faction is essentially giving loud voice to that deep-seated desire within the progressive movement to reduce reliance on the U.S. and carve out a more independent, perhaps more balanced foreign policy posture.
But this kind of bluster, this rhetoric, it carries huge diplomatic risks, surely. Especially when dealing with a transactional and, frankly, unpredictable administration in Washington like Trump's.
The diplomatic concerns are acute, yes. Professional diplomats, the alliance faction folks, they fear that this political posturing deliberately inciting anti-American public opinion for domestic consumption could provoke President Trump directly and unpredictably.
What's the specific danger they foresee?
The specific danger is that if the rhetoric is viewed in Washington as disrespectful or fundamentally uncooperative, Trump could just retaliate. He could impose the maximum 25% tariff on all Korean goods, which would be devastating. Or he could even activate previously threatened punitive measures, like the talked-about 100% tariff on specific imported goods, maybe cars. As one source lamented, the real danger is that Seoul could end up losing both the negotiations and irreparably damaging the core security relationship simply to achieve a temporary domestic political win. They risk a truly irreversible breakdown.
Let's contextualize the Progressive Party's ideology a bit further. This desire for strategic autonomy isn't something that just popped up. It has historical roots, a certain skepticism toward Washington.
Oh, the roots are definitely deep. We can recall key statements over the years that really illustrate this ideology. Lee Jae-myung himself, in the past, referred to U.S. forces stationed in Korea as an occupying army. That reflects a fundamental discomfort with the permanent presence of foreign troops, even under an alliance framework.
And his stance toward North Korea.
Furthermore, his previous advocacy for what he called a dirty peace with North Korea, stressing that a dirty peace is better than a victorious war, demonstrates a real commitment to patience and accommodation with the North, even if it comes at the cost of strict alignment with U.S. security doctrine, which tends to be more confrontational. His philosophy seems to prioritize peninsular stability and reducing regional tensions above all else.
And that underlying ideology informed the party's actions almost as soon as they came back under power, didn't it? Targeting the previous administration's foreign policy approach.
Indeed. One of the Progressive Party's early moves was a motion to impeach the previous president. A significant part of their reasoning focused heavily on his values-based diplomacy. They accused the former administration of unnecessarily antagonizing neighboring powers, specifically naming China, Russia, and North Korea, by pursuing an alignment that was seen as too focused on the U.S. and Japan axis.
So it's a consistent theme. It underscores a very consistent theme within the progressive movement, seeking accommodation and prioritizing economic partnership with regional powers first, rather than rigid strategic alignment with Washington's broader geopolitical priorities. You might remember Lee's own prior questions, asking publicly, why should we get involved in the Taiwan Strait issue? What does it matter to us? That clearly illustrates this more continental, perhaps even non-aligned strategic approach. This entire high-stakes conflict over cash, profit splits, tariffs, it feels like it's ultimately forcing a fundamental re-examination of the U.S.-Korea alliance itself. Which brings us to our final section, redefining the alliance and South Korea's pursuit of strategic autonomy.
Absolutely. The dispute has, I think, ruthlessly exposed a growing asymmetry and maybe even a strategic disconnect in the relationship. The U.S., operating under this very transactional framework, seems to view this massive trade deal and the investment demand purely as leverage a tool to gain immediate financial benefits and perhaps long-term security concessions, particularly related to its broader China strategy.
And Seoul's perspective.
Seoul, conversely, increasingly views itself not as some kind of client state, but as a powerful, technologically advanced global partner. A partner that deserves to negotiate as an equal, not as a subordinate who is simply obliged to pay, well, protection money, essentially.
This feeling of being a global partner versus a subordinate must be particularly acute among younger generations in South Korea, who've really only known prosperity and global cultural influence, right? K-pop, Samsung.
Yes, that generational shift is perhaps the most powerful underlying force driving this dynamic. Consider a young professional in Seoul today. They grew up with the global dominance of K-pop, Samsung's technological ubiquity, Hyundai's global automotive reach. They see South Korea as a genuinely leading nation.
So how do they view this standoff?
For them, the government's resistance to what they perceive as coercive U.S. demands isn't necessarily anti-Americanism per se. It's seen as a necessary act of national self-respect, a pro-Korea assertiveness. They view the government's current stance as reflecting Korea's new place in the world. They're insisting on fairness and fundamentally rejecting the kind of subservient dynamic that maybe their parents' generation tacitly accepted during the post-war recovery era.
This really suggests that the U.S.'s use of this kind of transactional diplomacy, trying to coerce large financial concessions, carries some severe long-term strategic risks for the alliance itself.
The risks are profound, I think. The alliance's enduring strength for decades has always rested on a perceived foundation of mutual benefit and fairness, even if imperfectly realized. When the U.S. resorts to what looks like coercion and financial brinkmanship, it risks doing lasting damage. It fuels the exact kind of anti-American sentiment that the autonomous faction is already weaponizing for political gain.
And long-term consequence.
If the South Korean public starts viewing the alliance primarily as exploitative rather than protective or mutually beneficial, it fundamentally erodes the popular support necessary to maintain the decades-old security commitment. And that's regardless of the persistent threats from North Korea. Public opinion matters. The stalemate also seems to be forcing Seoul to confront a crucial strategic divide: its own traditional threat perception versus Washington's current global priorities. That's the unspoken, huge security cost of this negotiation, isn't it? Seoul's traditional threat matrix has been overwhelmingly continental, focused almost entirely on North Korea. This required building a heavy, peninsula-bound, largely army-centric force structure.
But Washington's focus has shifted.
Washington's current strategic priority, however, is clearly maritime strategic competition with China across the Indo-Pacific. To sustain high-level U.S. support and justify the alliance's cost, Washington is subtly but firmly pressuring Seoul to articulate a clearer regional role.
And what does that entail?
A role that involves shifting its military focus towards a more maritime and air-heavy composition, one that's better aligned with broader East Asian security architecture, including, significantly, potential Taiwan contingencies. This kind of shift requires massive financial investment and really deep doctrinal changes within the South Korean military. It's not a small ask.
Speaking of contingencies, the pressure on President Lee to make explicit commitments regarding these extra-peninsula security issues, like the Taiwan Strait, must be absolutely immense right now behind closed doors.
It is the ultimate high-wire act for Seoul. Washington isn't just asking for money here. They are seeking clear pre-commitments, particularly regarding Taiwan. These likely include providing crucial rear area support, things like access to South Korean ports, airfields, and logistical hubs for U.S. forces operating in the event of a Taiwan Strait conflict.
And Seoul's position on that has always been, well, while the previous conservative administration acknowledged the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, Seoul has always meticulously avoided naming China explicitly as a strategic competitor or guaranteeing specific military access in a Taiwan scenario. Any open concession here would severely damage Seoul's vital economic relationship with Beijing. It perfectly illustrates the profound strategic choice Lee is being forced to make: financial stability via a deal with the U.S. versus regional economic stability by maintaining careful relations with China. So as we move toward this APEC summit deadline in Gyeongju in late October, what are the potential pathways to resolution? What kind of compromises could realistically break this deadlock while still protecting South Korea's financial red lines?
Seoul is currently walking an incredibly tightrope. They had to successfully defend their national dignity and economic sovereignty, which is politically essential at home, while simultaneously demonstrating just enough flexibility to avoid the catastrophic tariff shock if talks collapse completely.
So some kind of face-saving might be needed.
Experts suggest that symbolic gestures for political victory, maybe a headline figure or a deal name that President Trump can claim domestically as a win, might be inevitable. However, the substance of the concessions must be very carefully managed to ensure South Korea's financial liquidity isn't fatally compromised.
What might those specific managed concessions actually look like in practical terms?
Well, they mostly involve structuring the payment to mitigate that massive reserve shock we talked about. Potential pathways could include agreeing to phased investment rollouts over a significantly longer period, say 5 to 10 years, maybe even longer, instead of that killer upfront cash demand.
Okay, spreading it out. What else?
Another pathway could be securing a limited, defined bilateral currency swap arrangement. Not the unlimited line they want, but perhaps something smaller, say $50 billion, as a partial safety net. Seoul could also try to use other bargaining chips, maybe offering limited additional agricultural market access to try and offset some of the cash demand.
But the control issue remains.
Crucially, yes. Seoul continues to insist that any investment vehicle created must have commercial viability guaranteed, partly through giving them an equal voice in fund allocation. They want to ensure they are actually investing for a potential return, not simply subsidizing U.S. industrial policy goals with Korean money.
And we know the APEC summit in Gyeongju in late October is looming. That's got to be a natural pressure point for forcing some kind of resolution or at least progress.
It is definitely an intense focal point on the calendar, although it's worth noting that some experts, like Seoul National University law professor Lee Jae-min, have suggested the gap between the two sides, particularly on the profit split and the currency swap, is currently too wide to bridge quickly. He felt a final deal seemed unrealistic before APEC.
But the pressure remains intense.
Absolutely. The pressure remains fierce. Both sides know that going past that deadline without a clear path forward risks further market volatility and potentially irreparable damage to the diplomatic relationship. Time is certainly ticking.
This deep dive has really shown us how a massive financial demand has violently ripped open these deep political and strategic fault lines in one of America's most critical alliances. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, what we've explored here are really those three critical interlocking layers. First, the truly existential financial threat posed by asking Seoul to deplete 84% of its reserves in one go. Second, the tactical, almost cynical use of hyper-politicized domestic rhetoric by the progressive faction to mobilize public sentiment and try to gain negotiating leverage. And third, the core dilemma of a powerful middle state, South Korea, trying to navigate this incredibly painful process of redefining its decades-old alliance, moving from a relationship of perhaps subordinate reliance to one seeking genuine equal partnership.
So what we're witnessing here is not just a negotiation over money, is it? It feels much bigger than that.
It really does. It feels like the difficult and sometimes painful process of a key Asian ally asserting its economic sovereignty and its national dignity on the world stage. And the outcome will likely set a precedent for whether the future of the U.S.-Korea alliance, and perhaps other U.S. alliances too, will be one based more on mutual respect or on continued coercion.